Hello again and welcome to chesslecture.com. My name is Dana Mackenzie. Today I'm going to give the third lecture in my series on tactical motifs. This time we're going to talk about skewers and X-ray attacks. Mostly about skewers, and then I'll say a little bit at the end about X-ray attacks. So I'd like to start out this lecture with an example. So what we're looking at here is a position from a game from the 1986 World Chess Olympiad between Garry Kasparov, who's playing white, and Stefano Tottai, Italian international master, who's playing black. Of course, Kasparov was at this time the world champion. And as we look at this position, we see that Kasparov has sacrificed a pawn in order to get a big attack on black's king, and he's sort of flushed black's king out into the open, which is good. But now there's a problem, which is that black's king is attacking white's knight. And so you might wonder, what is white going to do about this? Well, if it were you or me, we probably would do something like knight to e4, moving the knight back. But that kind of, although that's a pretty good move, it sort of slows down the attack. And there's a much more powerful move in this position, which Garry Kasparov found, a move which basically ends the game in two moves. So I want you to look for it, see if you can tell what it is. Are you ready? Okay, so what Kasparov played here was queen to g7 check. So he's just allowing Tottai to take his knight with his king. King takes knight. But of course, Kasparov had something up his sleeve here. So do you see what the winning move is here for white? It's queen to f8 check. And the point behind this move is that after the king moves away somewhere, for example, king to c7, then white will leap down here to a3, capturing black's queen. And so basically, white has won a queen for a knight and now has a huge advantage in material. And so the Italian international master resigned. Actually, he resigned a move earlier. He resigned at this point because he saw that the loss of the queen was inevitable. All right, this is our first example of a tactic that's called a skewer, or in this case, sometimes called an X-ray check. Why do we call it that? Well, I think to me it's a very evocative name. Basically, the queen's attack on the king is kind of like an X-ray. It actually the lines of force radiate through black's king and hit black's queen, which seemed to be safely hidden behind the king. But after the king moves away from the X-ray, then the X-ray penetrates through and gets the queen. So it's this sort of ability of the X-ray attack to go through one piece and hit another piece behind it that is really unique, and that's why I like the phrase X-ray attack. Now, actually, when I started doing research on the internet for this article, I discovered that there is a little bit of debate over the exact meaning of the word X-ray attack. And at the end of the lecture, I'll discuss that a little bit if I have time. But for that reason, it's actually a little bit more correct to call this kind of attack a skewer. And so skewer is the word that I'll use through most of this lecture. But every now and then I might say X-ray check or X-ray attack. So hopefully you'll understand what I mean in each case. Okay, so this is our first example of an X-ray attack, and we'll be seeing a bunch more examples throughout this lecture. So let me say now what an X-ray attack or a skewer is. All right, in this position we can see a very simple example, simple-minded example of an X-ray attack. Here the white bishop is attacking the king, the black king, and through it is attacking the black knight on h7. So of course the king's in check, so it's got to move. And then after it moves, white will win the knight. Okay, so that is a very basic skewer or X-ray attack. So what is a skewer? A skewer is a situation where one piece attacks two of the opponent's pieces at the same time along the same line. Okay, so this bishop is attacking both the king and the knight along the same diagonal. Now, there's one other thing that ingredient you need to make it a skewer, and that's that the equal or more valuable piece has to be in front for a skewer. So in this case, a king is, of course, more valuable than a knight. A king is more valuable than any other piece. So when the king is in front, that makes it a skewer. Let me contrast this with exactly the same position with the pieces of the knight and king reversed. If you had the knight in front and the king in back, that would be a different tactical motif called a pin. And I'll show that to you right now. Here we see the same example, but with the positions of the king and knight reversed. So now the more valuable piece is in back, and the less valuable piece is in front. And that's what makes this a pin. Now you might wonder, why do we have separate names for pins and skewers? Because, after all, both of them are situations where you've got two pieces along the same line. Why does it matter which one's in front? The reason it matters is that the strategy of pins and skewers is really completely different. And that's why I'm not really going to talk about pins much in this lecture. But just let me point out here that when you have a pin, because the less valuable piece is the one that's being attacked, it's not likely to move. In this case, the knight cannot move by the rules of chess, because that would expose the king to check. So you know for sure that the knight is not going to move. And that tends to make the pin a more long-lasting strategic or tactical motif. Once a pin is set up, it'll often stay there for a move or two. So, for example, if we were in this position, black would probably play king to g6, and the pin is still there, black is just defending the knight. And in fact, white doesn't win any material by taking the knight with his bishop. So what usually happens in pins is that the pin stays there, and the strategy for white in this position is then to attack the pinned piece. So white would then advance his pawn to g4, attacking the pinned piece, and because it can't move, the piece is lost. So you can see that the way that you exploit a pin is quite different from the way you exploit a skewer. In the case of a skewer, the more valuable piece is in front, and so that means it's almost certain to move, and then you'll win the piece that's in back. So by comparison with a pin, a skewer is a very ephemeral, short-lasting tactical motif, where it's there just for one move, and you've got to take advantage of it while it's there, or else you've missed your chance. Okay, so that's the difference between a pin and a skewer. So very important, although slightly subtle difference. I'd also like to compare skewers with forks. So let me actually go back to my example of the skewer for just a moment. All right, so when we switch back to our skewer position, we see that what's similar between a skewer and a fork is that in a skewer you have one piece, again, attacking two pieces, just as in a fork. The only difference between a skewer and a fork is that in a fork the two pieces are along different lines. So your same piece is attacking in two different directions. But in a skewer, the piece is just attacking all along the same line. If there are any mathematicians out there, I used to be a mathematician, so I think a mathematician would call this a degenerate example of a fork, because the two lines sort of degenerate into one. And so my reason for mentioning this is that actually the strategy behind skewers is really very similar to forks, because forks also don't usually last on the board for a very long time. You play them and then they're gone. You play them, the guy moves one piece, you take the other. And similarly, in the skewer, you play the check here, the king moves, you take the knight, and that's it. So just like a fork, a skewer is a very short-lasting strategy. Okay, so there's our definition of what a skewer is. Now let's do a few more practical examples. I'd say that unlike forks and even and definitely unlike pins, skewers become more and more common as the game goes on. So skewers don't occur so often in the opening. They occur more often in the middle game, and they're particularly important in the end game. So we're going to kind of see this progression in this lecture. So I'm going to start out with the game I played, which has a skewer in the opening, and it's quite an unexpected sort of skewer. It's an unusual example, precisely because skewers don't usually come up quite so early. All right, this example is a game that I played against an expert named Larry Snyder from California about 2 years ago in a tournament in Reno. I'm white, and Snyder is black. And so the game begins with e4, e5, f4. Now, as those of you who listen to my lectures on the King's Gambit know, I'm a partisan of the King's Gambit. I enjoy playing it. So you can see some of my King's Gambit ideas from this game, as well as the skewer idea that we're going to see a little bit later. All right, Snyder took the pawn. I played bishop to c4, which, as you may know from my earlier lectures, is the bishop's variation, which I prefer in the King's Gambit. Snyder played d5. This is a line that I actually didn't cover in my King's Gambit lectures, but it's another very thematic line where Black's goal is not to hang on to his extra pawn, but instead to return a pawn in order to get rapid and easy development of his own pieces. I played bishop takes pawn. He played knight to f6, developing his knight, attacking my bishop. I go knight to c3, developing my knight and defending the bishop. And he goes bishop to b4, which attacks the knight and thereby threatens to win a pawn because the bishop needs to have two defenders. So I reply to this with queen to f3. Now, incidentally, this is not actually the main book line. The book move here is actually knight to f3. But I actually like queen to f3. It seems to me to have some good points to it, which we're going to see in this game. All right, he played queen to e7, which is a very reasonable move. This now sets up a pin along the e-file. So remember I mentioned that the pins are very common in the opening stages of the game. So the threat here for black is that he'd like to first take my knight and then go knight takes bishop, and then I won't be able to take back with my pawn because that would put me in check. All right, so you can see that black is has a little bit of initiative here, but nothing too dangerous. It's easy for me to defend. I play knight to e2, which is a good developing move. This breaks the pin on the e-pawn. It gives the knight another defender. So if black plays bishop takes knight, I can now go knight takes bishop if I want. And also, the knight move attacks his f-pawn. So I'm now attacking that pawn twice. So just a good developing move. He plays c6, attacking the bishop. I go bishop to b3. And then he goes bishop to g4. Now this is an interesting point. And this is a very tempting move for black to play because I've stuck my queen out there on f3 where it looks kind of vulnerable. And I think that's one reason that queen to f3 is not considered the book variation. But actually, surprisingly, black doesn't gain as much as you might think from this little attack on the queen. And so I'm not at all afraid of this move. And in this game, you'll see why. So let's just keep on going. So I go queen takes pawn, which is natural enough. And he plays bishop takes knight. Now, the idea here is, of course, white has won a pawn, and so black wants to win it back. And the way he's going to win it back is that after I go knight takes bishop, now he's going to win my e-pawn. But when you look at this position, there are a few little problems for black. For example, he'd probably prefer to win the e-pawn by knight takes pawn, but that just doesn't work because I'll play bishop takes f7 check. In my King's Gambit lectures, I pointed this out as a real common motif in the King's Gambit, this vulnerable pawn on f7. And the point here is that if black plays queen takes bishop, I go queen takes knight check, and I remain a pawn up with a very comfortable position. So this is no good for black. So he can't go knight takes pawn, but he can apparently go queen takes pawn. So that's what he does. And so black has won back the pawn. I go queen takes queen. He goes knight takes queen. and then I go castles. All right, and now, remember the theme of this lecture was skewers, so I want you to see if you can start seeing a skewer developing in this position. My opponent had no idea that there was anything at all out of the ordinary about this position, and basically what he sees is that by castling, I've set up a double attack on his pawn on f7. So I'm now threatening bishop takes pawn check, which would move his king out into the open, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he defends the threat in the obvious way by castling. But this now walks into the skewer that I talked about earlier. Okay, so white now can win the game with the correct move. Do you see what it is? Rook to f4. Now, I've got to admit, this is kind of a shock. It's definitely a shock to my opponent. I saw this coming a couple of moves earlier, and I just thought it was really kind of amazing, because if you just look at this position, it looks so innocent. You know, it looks as if both sides are relatively even in development, and there's not that much going on, or so it would appear, and yet white was threatening this nasty skewer, and there's no way for black to escape it. So the point is that if the knight moves, the bishop behind it will fall. Okay, so there we see kind of the X-ray nature of the skewer. So he's either got to lose the bishop or the knight. He could try going like bishop takes pawn, but then I get the knight, or he could try knight takes pawn, but then I get the bishop. The only way he could try to get out would be to play bishop to c5 check, but then I played d4, and he's still got two pieces under attack, both the knight and the bishop, and so he's got to lose one of them. You might ask, well, can't he defend the knight? Well, no, he can't, because if he goes, say, rook to e8, then he loses big time to bishop takes f7 check. And there's nothing else in his position that can defend the knight. The f pawn can't do it. He can't go f5 because that pawn is pinned against his king. So he's got no way to defend the knight, and if he moves the knight, he loses bishop. If he moves the bishop, he loses the knight. So he just, whatever he does, he loses a piece. And so, in fact, he resigned right here on move 13. So a beautiful little opening trap. The funny thing is, it looks like it ought to be a book trap, but as far as I know, it's not in any opening books. It just sort of magically appeared in this game. So that's kind of cool. So if you're on your toes, the skewer can be a really tricky little tactical motif that you can catch people with. All right, for my next example of a skewer, I'd like to look at a game between two grandmasters. Rustam Kasimjanov is white, and Alexander Grishuk is black. They're both, as I said, grandmasters. This game occurred in the 2004 FIDE World Championship, and as some of you may know, Kasimjanov actually won that tournament and was FIDE champion for a year in what was considered quite an upset. And actually, this game was a critical one for him. This was really the game that helped him win his match against Grishuk, who was rated higher than him. So in this position, as I said, Kasimjanov is white, Grishuk is black, and Grishuk actually probably has a somewhat better position here because he's got two bishops against two knights. And also notice that this bishop on b3 is threatening white's pawn on a4. So there's a real question of how white is going to hang on to this pawn. Now, it's black's move here, actually, and black should not play bishop takes pawn right away, for reasons we'll see. But in fact, what black played was even worse than bishop takes pawn. He played bishop to c2. All right, so now let's, again, I'd like you to pause and take a look at this position and see if you can figure out how white is going to set up a skewer. The skewer is not there quite yet. So the question is, how do you find a skewer? How do you spot it when it's not obvious it's there? Well, one thing I talked about in my lecture about forks is the importance of unprotected pieces. So you might remember that I said that the most common pieces to be forked are undefended pieces. And the same is true about skewers. Skewers are particularly effective when one of the pieces is undefended. So you need to look in this position for which black pieces are undefended. Now, a second thing to know about skewers is that probably the other most common piece to get skewered is a king. And that's actually true of forks also, and I didn't mention that in my forks lectures. I probably should have. So kings also are sort of the ultimate good piece to be the front piece in a skewer, because when you attack the king, it's got to move. It can't stay there. And so then once it moves, you win the back piece, and you're very happy. Okay, so that was a little bit of a hint. So in this position, you should be looking for an undefended black piece, and you should be looking for the black's king. And then we should think about ways to chase black's king onto a line that will create a skewer with that undefended piece. Okay, so now I've given you all the ingredients you need. Let me show you what Kasimdzhanov played. He played a beautiful little knight sacrifice, knight to e6 check. Okay, and what's the point of this move? Well, it's a check, of course, and checks, force your opponent to do something about that. Now, if black moves his king, where is he going to move to? Well, he doesn't want to move to b7, because then he'd just lose a piece to knight takes bishop check. So he kind of has to move to b6. But now he's moved his king onto the line with the undefended rook. Did you see? I gave you all those hints. Okay, so did you see that rook on b2 is undefended? So that means white can now play the skewer, rook to b8 check, attacking the king, and then the x-ray passes through the king all the way to black's rook on b2. And after the king moves away, say to a7, then the rook is history. Also, a minor side point here is that if black were to interpose his rook, he would still lose material, because the knight is going to capture the undefended bishop on c5. So there is a little bit of an extra ingredient to this skewer, namely the fact that it starts out with the knight fork attacking the king and black's other unprotected piece, which is the bishop. So really in this position we're seeing two themes at once, the theme of the fork and the theme of the skewer, which is good, because in chess you don't always get purely one theme or purely one motif or purely another. You have to know all of these motifs, and you can sometimes weave them together, and that's what makes grandmasters, is their ability to do this. Okay, so we've seen that black loses material if he plays king to b6 or king to b7. Now, there's one other move that I have to mention, of course, which is rook takes knight, perhaps the most obvious defense. But now white again has a way of chasing black's king into the skewer. He plays rook to d7 check, and now the king has only one move, king to b6, and then once again we play the skewer, rook to b8 check. And this is in fact the way that the game went. Onishuk then played king to a6, which is forced, and Kasimdzhanov played rook takes b2. And unlike our first example, the game's not over here. Basically what's happened is white sacrificed a knight in order to win a rook. So black can still play on. He's not that far down in material. And in fact, as I said, he's probably going to go bishop takes pawn and have a pawn for the exchange. But still, obviously, the position has transformed totally in white's favor. Previously, black had the advantage and was hoping to win. Now white has a clear advantage. And in fact, Kasimdzhanov did go on to win the game as white. Now, as I said earlier, one thing that's interesting about skewers, as compared with forks and even pins, is that skewers take on great importance in the endgame. I don't think that forks happen quite as often in endgames, but skewers happen a whole lot. And here's a really, really basic rook endgame. To understand this position, you really need to know about a skewer. So here it's white to move, and white is moving away from you, of course. And so he's got a pawn on a7 that's about to queen. But the trouble is that his rook is in the way of it. And so these rook and pawn endgames all kind of boil down to a struggle. Can white get his rook out from in front of the pawn and at the same time not lose the pawn so that he can then queen it on the next move? And so if it were white's move here, then white would play rook to h8, which releases the rook from in front of the pawn. And the whole point here of the skewer is that if black plays rook takes pawn, white is going to play rook to h7 check, and that's a skewer of the king and the rook. The king moves out of the way, and then white wins the rook and has a one endgame of king and rook versus king. Okay, so as we go back to the original position, we can see that if it were white's move, he would win by playing this skewer idea. So then the question is, suppose it's black's move, what is black going to do about this? Now, I think a lot of players here would have the gut response of they want to move their king towards the pawn. And if white were to play along with this, this would be good for black. Okay, so black's idea is he's going to go over to the pawn and win it with his king. So these moves I'm playing are all bad, but you'll see this is black's plan. He wants to move his king over to the queen side, win the pawn, and then it'll be an easy endgame draw for him. Now, unfortunately, that plan does not work, because if he moves towards the pawn, then white will again play rook to h8 and set up a skewer. Rook takes pawn, and rook to h7 check. So in these endings, you have the very counterintuitive fact that the defending side cannot move his king towards the pawn. Incidentally, if you tried moving king to e6 to avoid the skewer, then white would still get his rook out from in front of the pawn, because he'd play rook to e8 check. And then black goes king to d7, white pushes his pawn, queens it, and once again gets to a winning ending of king and rook versus king. So playing this position as black, you cannot move your king towards the pawn, which is really counterintuitive. It's, against everything you've ever learned in chess. This guy is a passed pawn. You want to stop it. You want to win it. But no, the correct way to play this endgame, if you're black, is actually to go king g7, running away from the pawn. And the point here is that now white can never set up a skewer, because he can't get around the king to the other side. And, of course, if he goes somewhere else, then, black will just take the pawn, and there's no way for white to win that rook. And in fact, there is no way for white to win this position. He can try to move his king closer if he wants, but black just kind of goes la-di-da and ignores it. Okay? The only time that black needs to start worrying is when that king actually gets close to the a pawn. Now white is threatening to play rook to g8 check, freeing up, well, actually no, it's just planning to move his rook out from in front of the pawn, freeing the pawn up to queen. So at this point, and only at this point, black needs to start checking the king away. And as you can see, there's absolutely no place the white king can run to. Wherever he goes, black is just going to check, 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 okay, until the king gets too close to the rook, and then the rook will move out of the way of the king, and once again we see that white's made absolutely no progress. He's still got no hope of getting his rook out from in front of the pawn. Okay, so this is a very, very basic rook and pawn endgame, and as I said, really the key point, the key thing which I think most beginners would not realize is this idea that you've got to move your king away from the pawn in order to avoid the skewer. Okay, let me show you a somewhat more involved example with the same theme, just to kind of cement this idea of why this endgame is important. So I'm going to show you an example from a tournament game I played in 1988 against a guy named Gustavo Hernandez, who was, I was told at the time, was the champion of the Dominican Republic. All right, in this game, I was black and Hernandez was white. And actually, what I'm going to show you is a variation that didn't happen, but is very relevant to what we were just talking about. So in this position, my opponent actually played rook to b6, and the game was very soon drawn after rook takes pawn check, and then rook to a4, getting the rook behind the pawn. He pushed to a6, but he wasn't able to actually get his queen as pawn, and the game ended up being a draw. So some people were watching this game and asked him afterwards, well, why didn't you keep the rook in front of the a pawn? So for example, white could play something like rook to a8 with the idea of advancing the pawn and having the rook in front of it, defending it. Well, actually, if you know anything about rook and pawn endgames, you know that it's usually a bad idea. If you're advancing your pawn, it's usually a bad idea to have your rook in front of it. And we saw why in that last example, because you still got the problem of how to get the rook out from in front of it, and so that you can actually queen the pawn. And that's exactly the problem that white would run into here. If he'd played that, I would have gone rook takes pawn check, king to g3, rook to a4, getting behind the pawn. And now if for example, white starts pushing the pawn, then here's where knowing the previous endgame is actually a help. Okay, so remember, the only thing black needs to worry about is the skewer, the idea that white will push his pawn to a7 and then move his rook over to h8 and skewer his king and rook. So the simplest way to defend is simply to go king to f7. Again, a little counterintuitive, moving the king away from the pawn. And then if white goes to a7, then I go king to g7. And now we've got an example just like the previous one, where white cannot ever liberate his rook. And if he moves his rook out from in front of the pawn, he's just going to lose the a pawn. In fact, in this position, you could take away both of black's pawns, and it would still be a draw. Even though white's 2 pawns ahead, white would never be able to make progress because black's king would be in the way of the h pawn, and white's own rook is in the way of the a pawn, and white's king can never do anything to help because it would always be checked away by black's rook. So I urge you, if you don't believe it, check it out. Take the 2 black pawns off the board and play around with this for both sides. And you'll see that just like our last example, this is a dead draw for black. So this is really handy to know because it's nice to know an example like this where you can be 2 pawns behind and still have a complete easy draw. Of course, in this case, it's even better than that for me because I actually had the 2 pawns. But the nice thing is I knew I didn't have to worry. I didn't have to sweat because this was a draw. Okay, now for my last example of a skewer, I'm going to take you through another ending that I played. This was in 2003. I'm white, and I'm playing against actually a friend of mine named Ilan Benjamin, who is black. And this was one of these games where I kind of got a bad position early in the game and was just fighting the whole game to draw. Just fighting and fighting. And at this point, I really thought I had it. And I'll show you why I thought that I had a draw in a second. So in this position, I played what actually turns out to be the correct move, king to c3. It is, I should have said, it's white to move here. Now, the question is, how is black going to try to win this game? It seems as if black might have some winning chances because his king is closer to white's pawn than white's king is to black's pawns. So, but unfortunately, if black goes straight after white's pawns with king to f2, that doesn't work because white is just going to shadow the king every step. And after he goes king takes pawn, white is going to go, it's going to go king to f2, and now black's king is locked into the corner. It cannot escape. So if the king tries to get out, white's just going to play king to f3. So black can never get his king out from in front of his pawns. And that means he's unable to advance his pawns to create a passer. So for example, if he plays h4, white will go pawn takes pawn, black will go king takes pawn, and then white just goes king to f4, and black has no way to defend the f pawn, and the ending's just going to be a simple draw. So I saw all of this in the initial position, and that's why I thought that basically I was going to draw this game, because I saw that black cannot win the game by moving his king over and trying to win the h-pawn. However, black does have another resource, which I did not properly appreciate at the time. So my opponent, Ilan Benjamin, played a very clever move, h4. And the idea of this move is that he wants to sucker me into taking the h-pawn and create a passed pawn of his own along the f file. And here I played a terrible blunder. Okay, so I was too confident. You know, I was already thinking in my head that the game was going to be a draw, and I didn't see what the point was of black's move. So you might want to stop here and see if you can figure out what's going to happen, and what does this have to do with skewers. Okay, so as I said, I played here the losing move, pawn takes pawn. And this now sets up a pawn race. He goes f4, I go h5, he goes f3, I go h6, he goes f2, I go h7, he goes f1, queening his pawn, I go h8, queening my pawn. And, you know, so of course I worked this all out in my head, and I thought, well, this is fine for white. You know, we both queen our pawns. Now I'm actually a pawn ahead, but, you know, it's more than likely going to be a draw, right? Well, I looked one move too few, because in this position, black now plays queen to a1 check, and it's a long-distance skewer. The queen attacks the king, and after the king moves, the queen goes all the way across the board and takes my queen, and I'm screwed. I am lost. So, oh man, this was really a heartbreaker to me when I saw this. Of course, I didn't actually go all the way to this point. I think I resigned about here when I realized that after he queened, he was going to get the skewer. So that was a good lesson to me, and hopefully it'll be a good lesson to you too. So what can you learn from this example? Well, here's a case, another situation in the endgame where skewers frequently arise is in pawn race situations. When both sides queen, it's not enough just to analyze up to the point where both sides queen. You need to analyze past that point and look at any checks that might occur afterwards, because often there's a skewer right after that which will enable one side or another to win the game. We certainly saw that in this example. There's another example very much like that in John Paul Wallace's lecture on Pawn Endgames 101, which he gave a month or so ago. So if you go back to that lecture, you'll find he did a king and pawn endgame once again, where both sides queen their pawns, but one of the players then followed up with a skewer that got the opponent's queen. So this is not at all an unusual theme. Anytime you have close pawn races where both sides are queening, you've got to be on the lookout for skewers. In fact, there's a marvelous example of this in the movies. If you've ever watched the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, and if you haven't seen that movie, you really should. It's a great movie, but it's loosely based on the life of Joshua Waitzkin, who was a really good U.S. junior player about 10, 15 years ago. And in the movie, the sort of climactic scene has Josh playing against his big rival in the last round of a tournament. And they get to a position exactly like this, with the pawn race on opposite sides of the board. And Waitzkin's opponent queens his pawn first, but then Waitzkin queens his pawn with a check, and it's a skewer. It's once again, it's exactly the same skewer that we saw in this position, where we had the diagonal. Okay, so it was a skewer exactly like this one. So if you go back and watch the movie, you'll see this practically this identical position occurring. I think the colors are maybe reversed, and probably that other pawn isn't there. But it was a great choice for the filmmakers because it is a case of an unexpected dramatic reversal in the outcome. So a good dramatic position. So there's a nice example of a skewer in chess history. I'd like to end my lecture by talking about one more thing, which is an X-ray attack. So you might recall I said at the beginning of the lecture that X-ray attack is another name that's sometimes used for skewers. But when I started looking this up on the internet, I realized that X-ray attack is also used for something else, which is similar but not exactly the same as a skewer. And so just for the sake of completeness, I'd like to show you an example of an actual bona fide X-ray attack that's not a skewer, so that you'll have this in your repertoire as well. All right, in this example, we're going to look at an old game between Mikhail Chigorin, who's a Russian player in the early 1900s, and Eugene Znasko-Borovsky, who was also a Russian player at the same time. This game was played in 1903. And as we look at this position, it's white to move. White is Chigorin. And we can see that white has given up in exchange for a couple of pawns, but he has some dangerous threats against black's king. In particular, look at this battery of the queen and bishop, which would threaten to deliver mate, queen to f8 mate, if only black's rook weren't defending that square. So in this position, Chigorin played a pretty little combination that was designed to exploit that fact. And we'll see an X-ray attack occurring in this combination. So first of all, Chigorin played knight to e7 check. Okay, so this is a knight sacrifice, which is designed to lure black out of position. Now, in this position, black probably should have taken with the front rook, with the rook on e2. If he'd done that, then Chigorin would have had the very pretty move, queen takes e7. This offers a queen sacrifice, which black cannot accept, because white would then get a back rank checkmate with rook to d8. However, this would still have been better for black than what he played in the game, because black could play queen to e6. And this is actually the first of two examples of X-rays in this position. So it's sort of an X-ray defense, because the queen on e6 is defending the rook on e8 through white's queen. So it's like the lines of force pass through the opponent's piece and help him defend the rook on e8. So I would kind of call this an X-ray defense rather than an X-ray attack. And so basically, in this position, white would probably trade queens, and of course black would not go rook takes queen because he'd be checkmated. Instead, he'd go pawn takes queen, and we'd have an endgame where white's two pawns up and probably winning, definitely winning, but it'd take a little while. Now, instead, black played rook takes knight with the other rook, which lost in very beautiful fashion. Okay, here Chigorin played rook to d8 check, and black has only one defensive move, which is rook to e8, and black probably figured that he was doing fine here, because he's defended against the checkmate threat, and what more can white do? If white goes rook takes rook, big deal, you have a rook trade. But what he missed was the X-ray attack. Okay, white plays queen to f8 check, and we once again see this idea of an X-ray. The rook on d8 defends the queen on f8 through black's rook on e8. So again, the lines of force from your piece pass through the opponent's piece. And in this case, it's an X-ray attack because the white queen is attacking black's king. And so in this position, all black can do is rook takes queen, and then white follows it up with rook takes rook checkmate. So that's an example of an X-ray attack, which is, as I said, slightly different from a skewer, but it has the similar theme of one piece's forces passing through another piece and influencing events beyond it. So it's similar in that respect. Okay, so in this lecture you've seen skewers, a whole bunch of skewers. You've also seen an X-ray attack. And I think just to recapitulate, some of the key points here to remember are that when you're looking for skewers, the pieces that are good to look at skewering are undefended pieces and kings. And another lesson to learn from some of these examples that we've seen is the importance of moving your opponent's pieces around. So you can move the opponent's pieces with sacrifices, you can move it with checks, but you'll very often have to set up the skewer by a couple of preparatory moves. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. We'll continue next time with some more tactical motifs. The next tactical motif I'm going to look at is discovered checks and discovered attacks. For now, this is Dana McKenzie signing off.